Now onward, the event. An event so cataclysmic that it wouldn't be named anything else. What else could you possibly name the end of a universe? Well, I could think of several things, but that is not the point. The event occurs in the war, and indeed the universe itself is separated into three streams of existence, where a very different reality takes hold. History is rewritten to show that Aletheia and Inara always existed, though they most certainly have not. They'd only rose to power in the waning years of the universe before, just in time to be the causal force of the event. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 2. Enlisted. Bridget. We're the Council. So from what we can tell, you were out in the woods alone, and the wolf came along and beat the living shit out of you, and then, on a whim, decided to leave you there. A woman asked Bridget as she nodded her head. Her walk with Fierce had been pleasant enough, but he'd warned her that she wouldn't like this part nearly as much. She stood before 7 people who were seated in rather ornate chairs on a raised platform in a semicircle around her. They were on the peak of the tower that rose from the castle. The windows around them gave a full view of the surrounding countryside, both a strategic and beautiful viewpoint. "Aline, it sounds a little harsh when you put it like that," Fierce chimed in from where he was sitting. From what Bridget could tell, the 4 chairs were occupied by the leaders of the community, and their lieutenants sat at the foot of their chairs on raised platforms. Aline sat in the chair that was the furthest to the left. Her high cheekbones and sharp features were almost exaggerated by her sharp and tightly fitting bluish silver and gold armor. Her cat-like eyes watched everything with feral intensity, burning into Bridget's soul. To her right sat an old graying man by the name of Baterish, who was dressed in flowing golden robes. At first guess, Bridget assumed that he was the most holier-than-thou man up there, which meant that he was probably the head priest, which was a very good guess. At his feet sat a very boyish-looking man named Levain, with a curly mat of hair on his head and silver robes. Despite his age, he looked pompous as all hell. To his right sat a man who looked to be in his early 40s, and completely uninterested in the conversation. He was the only one wearing a crown in the room, so Bridget made the wild assumption that he was probably the king, or whatever was the equivalent to that around here. His black hair was cut short, and his graying beard was trimmed neatly. All in all, he looked very kingly, all the way down to his shining silver armor and piercing blue eyes. Everyone tended to call him Lord Varen. The girl who sat at his feet went by the name of Rain. She had raven black hair, and warm, glowing gold eyes, and soft features. She was probably near 20 years old. To the right of them sat the man called Caden. She couldn't remember if she had seen him before her dream, but she concluded that she must have. This was all very confusing because he looked exactly as he did in the dream, minus the bloody mess. His armor was almost exactly like Aline's in color. His hair was dark brown, and kept very short and messy. He sported a bit of a 5 o'clock shadow. His nose was noticeably broken, but in the process of healing. His left eye was blackened completely, and his right looked as if it was just on its way through the healing process. His face, in general, was covered in scratches that varied in severity. Bridget decided to make the assumption that he was far too busy with other things to worry about his battered appearance. In fact, he probably thought the whole meeting was a waste of precious time. Fierce sat at his feet, reclining a little too comfortably. Honestly, it seemed like Baterish, the priest, was the only one remotely interested in the whole thing. "What were you doing out there, child?" Baterish asked in a scratchy voice, typical of an older man. "I don't know," Bridget answered calmly. "How is it exactly that you do not know?" Levain interjected in a snotty tone. "Well, as far as I can remember, I got my ass beat by a giant fucking wolf. Memory lapse might just be the least of my worries. In case you didn't notice the wounds, I'm fairly lucky to be alive." "Hard not to notice them," Levain sneered. "It was pretty bad. I don't think I'm liable to remember much," she responded, curtly staring daggers back at the kid. If he wasn't careful, she might actually use her daggers, whenever she got them back, that was. "At the end of the day," Caden cut in before things got any more hostile, "we can't expect her to remember much after the trauma she experienced. If she was fighting the wolf, then there's a damn good chance she was and is on our side." "And how can we know that?" Levain asked from his seated position. Caden stood up suddenly, taking a step towards him. He had a tired look about him, but nonetheless looked more than capable of ripping Levain a new one. "Shut up," Caden said sternly and calmly. Levain tried to speak, but Baterish stopped him. "Heed his words, young one." Baterish hushed him with a small smack on the back of the head. Bridget couldn't help but smile. Caden turned to address her again. "Bridget, he said sternly. Yes, sir. She didn't know how else to respond. From where I'm standing, I see you holding two. He paused. Well, maybe three options. One, you tell us you are with the wolf, and I can't promise you'll make it out of here alive. Two, you tell us that you just want to go home, and we'll provide a needed armed escort, assuming you even know where home is. Or three, he said, stepping down from the platform and stopping just in front of Bridget. He was a head and a half taller, and from where he was standing, it looked like every blood vessel in his left eye had burst. You tell me that you rather enjoyed getting the shit kicked out of you, and you can't wait to try your hand against the wolf and his followers again. Your choice. What'll it be? He asked, looking her in the eyes. His gaze was that of a man much older than he should have been. He was just a bit more than a little intimidating. Well, sir, she responded, standing at attention, I rather enjoyed getting the shit kicked out of me, and I can't wait to try my hand against the wolf and his followers again. I like that answer, soldier, he said, lifting his hand to a salute. She lifted her hand in return without even thinking as he turned calmly and walked back to his chair. Bridget was in the process of understanding she just volunteered for the service without even realizing there was conscription. He was good, and she was still standing at attention. She gave herself a mental at ease and found herself at parade rest. She couldn't help but think that she might have been military of some sort before this whole experience. All of this just felt so right. Chapter 2. Continued. Caden. Storytime. It seemed like they'd finally finished giving her the third degree, which was good news for her, but bad news for me. I knew that it was my turn next, and reporting 3 casualties was not going to be fun, nor was explaining why I hadn't fallen back to the barricade with my men. I was a good liar, though, and I knew that I was about to fool everyone in the room, except Aline, because, well, she always saw right through me. Caden, my son. It was Baterish's voice calling me to the stand. It appears time for you to tell us what happened out there, he finished, sounding like an innocent old man. And maybe he was innocent, but I doubted it. Good luck, Fears whispered as he stood to take my place in the chair. He beckoned for Bridget to take his former seat, and she obeyed with only the slightest bit of hesitation. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," to me as I passed by her, taking her post in the center of the room. I guess that I did kind of pull her ass out of the fire at my own expense. "My lord, my lady," I began, staring straight at Varen, only glancing at his daughter for a second. "And, of course, our honored high priest," I said, nodding at Baterish before returning my gaze to Varen. I, of course, had to start with the information everybody already knew. The village was attacked in the night a few days back, and unfortunately I have some casualties to report. I began to pace slowly with my hands held behind my back. Tharn, Azur, and Araya fell while valiantly defending their posts. I chanced to glance at Aline, which was obviously a mistake. She was studying me, and more importantly, she knew that I was about to lie. The village attacked was my former forward operating base. There were very few civilians left, but unfortunately one was still killed in the fray. I looked up at Baterish as I said this. Feigning sincerity wasn't a problem. The death of this particular civilian deeply troubled me. "My men held the line valiantly," I said before a slight hesitation. "Unfortunately, under the pressure of overwhelming numbers, we were forced to temporarily surrender the village, but not before we felled many of the creatures." "Before you go on," Baterish interrupted, "your men reported that you went with them at the front line." I couldn't blame my men for giving the report accurately. In fact, I had ordered them to be truthful, even after they'd offered to lie for me. I knew that this was coming, though, which made it much easier to answer his pointed question. "I was at the scouts' posts," I responded shortly. "And protocol clearly states," Baterish interrupted, "that you should have retreated to the barricade, as quoted by your men." I'd known he'd keep using my own men against me. He would have made a terrible leader. "As it has probably been made clear to you," I said curtly, "the attack began with the wolf coming alone." I had stopped my pacing and now stared coldly at Baterish. "It caught you by surprise?" Levain piped in, anxious at the chance to get at me. "He is impossibly fast," I growled in return without even glancing at him. "As I was saying, the wolf arrived before the attack. By the time he was gone, I was in no condition to fight. It is a wonder I even made it back here at all, considering the fact that the first wave hit no less than 10 seconds after the wolf left." "So are you reporting to us that the wolf is capable of beating our best man?" Fiers asked, giving me the opening that I needed. Man? Yes, I responded gravely, but a much greater warrior than I sits in front of me, I said, gesturing to Aline stiffly. Aside from that, I learned much from my last contact with the wolf, I said, looking Varen in the eyes. After all, he was the one that had to be happy with our performance. I will not be humbled by him again, I finished with a curt nod. Varen nodded his approval, thus allowing me to return to my seat prematurely by Baterish's agenda. Bridget and Fiers both shared the position at my feet. Aline quickly took center stage before anything else went awry. She needed to take control of this room. She addressed Varen, Rain, and Baterish as I did before she beckoned Bridget to stand in front of her. It seems we have a new recruit, she said to the room as she looked at Bridget from head to toe. Bridget was barely shorter than Aline, but stood with a proud posture. I'll be keeping this one close to help with the preparation of our forces and defense of this fortress. Chapter 2. Continued. Bridget. Arguing over nothing. From the way the conversation was heading, Bridget could only assume that her days were about to get long and boring. Luckily, just before the meeting could adjourn on her fate, Caden spoke up. Aline, in light of our recent casualties, Aline fixed him with her cold feline stare. I could use her in the field, Caden said confidently as he stood. Thus far, we have witnessed nothing other than this poor girl losing every fight she's been party to, Aline responded, pushing Bridget out of the way with a light shove. Bridget could only stand there as the leaders fought over her like a piece of meat. Aline's statement stung, but it was true. She was disadvantaged in every fight we know of, he said, waving his hand in front of him as if declaring her statement irrelevant. We cannot let that be a factor that convinces us of her lack of skill. Nor can we allow it to attest to any amount of skill she may possess, she almost purred. We know nothing of her skill, as you've stated. I will be the judge of her usefulness. She almost finished before Caden was about to respond. Caden! She hissed the last word, which silenced Caden immediately. Fiers, you will assist me in the placement of our newest member, Aline said gently. I'll have you arm her and evaluate her. Yes, ma'am, Fiers replied, winking at Bridget from his seated position. Caden found his seat, looking slightly annoyed. He had a point in Bridget's opinion. He needed more men. It was at that moment that she heard Varen speak for the first time. Caden. His voice was warm, yet menacing, like molten gold. Rain will be accompanying you on your next journey into the woods, he said, gesturing to his daughter. My lord, I couldn't possibly... Caden started to respond before Rain stood suddenly. I am not a gift to be offered to you, she said with a bit of feistiness in her voice, nor am I an object which you can simply refuse to take with you. I choose the men under my command, Caden said firmly, glaring at her. Once he was satisfied with the silence, he proceeded to leave his chair and walk in front of Rain, who was still standing, her pride noticeably wounded. That being said, he paused before continuing, your assistance would be much appreciated, he finished with genuine sincerity. The man knew how to establish dominance, even when he was losing, Bridget concluded. Caden turned and nodded to Aline, who in turn nodded to Lord Varen. It seems we have a conclusion, he began. It is time my daughter learned the ways of war on the front lines. I trust you will leave her to her own devices, he said firmly to Caden. She'll have to earn her keep, sir, Caden responded coldly, eyeing Rain. Good, Varen responded sharply. Meeting adjourned. As quickly as it had begun, the meeting evaporated. Fiers grabbed Bridget and led her from the room as Aline made her way to Caden. It appeared that Baterish and Levain had somewhere to be as they hustled out of the room with their robes flowing behind them. Only Varen and Rain looked as though they would remain for any extended period of time. To the armory we go, Fiers began briefly as he grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the grand and ceremoniously oversized doors of the council room. What's the rush, soldier? Bridget asked playfully as Fiers dragged her onward. When Aline wants something done, it gets done. He paused, apparently unsatisfied with his sentence. It gets done quickly.
The history of the ensuing war is a long and tedious thing that would most accurately be depicted by the changing of seasons. For a while, one season shall rule, but then another, and inevitably another. For centuries and centuries this has continued without an imagined end. Indeed, for those that have been at it the longest, those such as Alpha and Aline, the war is not something being fought for victory, but rather survival. The view then becomes that the life of a warrior is a sacrifice, of all else that could have been, to preserve their home for but a time longer. Home is the fire, and they are but the wood to be burned away in agony to sustain the flame. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 2, continued. Caden, Rule 2.
What the hell was that?
Aline demanded of me.
What? That little tiff about who gets Bridget? I asked in a state of surprise.
No, not that, Aline said after a second. That was goddamn brilliant. Got that meeting over early.
Then what? I asked the question that I already knew the answer to.
That BS about losing the village,
she answered, fixing me with a cold stare. She was shorter than me, but was damn intimidating. We were in her living quarters, which bore a remarkable similarity to my own. There were no windows, and only one entrance, with about 5 different locks on it and 3 different ways to break it down from the inside. Her bed, which was in the right corner of the room, was simple, and had exactly 1 pillow, with a small knife underneath it. I knew this not from sight, but from past experience. This woman had trained me. Oh, more like refined me. I didn't recall where the training had directly come from. She had a side table that was loaded with the majority of her weapons, mostly just the small ones. Her swords would be on the side of the bed that was furthest from the door, the same side as the table. Her armor hung neatly on a mannequin in the back left corner. Her greaves rested on her nightstand, and her boots were at the foot of the bed. There were no decorations, just hard stone walls, floors, and a ceiling. She stood in front of me wearing nothing but what had been under her armor, and under the top layer of her clothing. Her hair was still pulled back in a tight ponytail, and only a few stray strands hung in front of her face. Her modest breasts were covered only by a lacy deep blue material that matched the shining color of her eyes. Her lower body was covered by a lace wrap of the same color that left one of her thighs exposed and grew diagonally to cover her other thigh completely. I couldn't help but wonder if there was anything else under that skirt. She still wore her thick black socks that went to about the height of her knees.
"Caden,"
she said, snapping in front of my face.
"You've got a story to tell me, I think."
"Can't ever slip a lie past you, can I?" I asked, looking past her at the rest of the bedroom. "I see you've redecorated," I said sarcastically as I walked past her towards her bed.
"Changing the subject,"
she blunted, turning her face towards me. "Yeah, I guess flipping over the pillow isn't really redecorating," I said nonchalantly, flipping it back over and scooping up the knife with my left hand.
"Well, maybe you can tell me about it a bit later,"
she purred as she came towards me. I turned quickly, swinging my left hand in a balled-up fist, holding the knife with the blade on the side of my little finger. She jumped back, but a fraction of a second too slow. The straps of her bra were cut, and it fell from her shoulders with the bra barely hanging on. "And what were you planning on doing in the meantime?" I asked, as though nothing had happened. She lifted her hands to her chest where the straps had been cut. A little blood was seeping out of the very thin cuts the knife had left. "You're getting slower, ma'am." I winked at her as I fell into a defensive stance. Just because she was my mentor didn't mean she was all that older than me. I guess 3 years at the most, if she was older at all. She gave me a razor-sharp smile before dropping into a similar stance. There was no happiness in that smile, just thrill and exhilaration. She held her lightly bloodied fingers in front of her face before wiping them clean on the cloth around her waist.
"Well, I had a couple of ideas,"
she whispered softly as she kept her right hand forward with her nails extended like claws. Her left was away from me and balled into a fist. All I was wearing at this point was a dark blue long-sleeve shirt that fit very loosely, with the sleeves hanging droopingly and the top third of my chest exposed from the extended V-neck. The pants I wore were more tightly fitting, but a belt and a couple of buttons were all that held them on. I wasn't even walking around with my boots. It was evening, and I was supposed to be relaxing, but this was as good of a way as any to unwind, if not a little hazardous. I kept my left hand with the knife back and my right hand forward and open. She attempted to swing at me with her right hand, which I caught deftly in my right and pulled her close. "Feisty," I commented, with her face only inches from mine. She delivered me a punch to the gut with her left hand, and I almost doubled over from the blow. Admittedly, I was still sore from my fight with the wolf.
"Come now, Caden. I thought I'd taught you a bit better than that,"
she chided as I rose up suddenly, cutting the center strap of her bra with my knife.
There was nothing else covering her breasts now, but she didn't mind. She allowed me to fall back a couple steps. She held her arms at her sides with her usual confidence. "Now your shirt," she said, cupping her own breasts. "That's not how this game works," I said with a smile. "Caden, with rank comes certain privileges," she said, taking a few steps forward. She was face to face with me now. I gave the knife an underhanded throw and watched it thud into the mannequin right in the exposed neck. "I make the rules," she purred into my ear as she scratched my exposed chest, cutting the skin lightly and ripping my shirt. "Rule 1. Take off your shirt." "What's in it for me?" I asked as I pulled her arms behind her back. "Rule 2, she answered as she breathed, kissing my lips lightly. My world exploded into a combination of overwhelming ecstasy and searing cold pain. I was pretty sure few people could withstand what she was doing to my mind. The only reason she likes me is because I'm around and I tend to survive the experience. Works for me, I thought to myself as the pain took a more pleasurable feel. The only reason I was with her was because it was fun, and surviving was a bit of a point of pride for me. Plus the fact that we probably shouldn't be doing it added to the excitement. Someday I hoped to love someone, and she probably did too. We knew it wouldn't be each other, but it was fun to let ourselves pretend that it didn't matter. Somehow I just knew she wasn't the right person.
And sustain it they have through much sacrifice and death. So much death. I have attended and personally hosted more funerals than I've seen gestacean sunsets, which is far too many. Honestly, the radiation from their sun, why anybody would choose to live there is beyond me. But who can understand the Broclean anyway? So on the fire burns and on the war rages. Of course, we should probably discuss the fronts upon which the war is fought. The observations of an over-observed observationist.
Chapter 2. Continued. Bridget. The After Party. "So, this here's what we call an armory," Fear said with a bit of a flourish as he almost slipped through the door in front of him. It was made of a thick, dark wood, like the racks that held most of the weapons and armor. Honestly, the equipment looked cheap, but beggars, or vagrants for that matter, couldn't be choosers, Bridget thought to herself if she examined a couple of the pieces. There didn't seem to be any weapons particularly to her liking, or skill set, but at least some of the armor looked as though it had been crafted for a woman. "All right. Now that I've seen the look on your face, I can show you the shiny toys," he said with a laugh, heading towards the back of the room. There wasn't much back there other than a secured and likely locked metal door. He turned the knob without any sense of hesitation and walked straight through, beckoning Bridget to follow it, and so she did. "Shouldn't that be, I don't know," she said, gesturing back at the door as she walked forward. "Locked? It's amazing how many people never bother to open it. Everyone just assumes it's locked," Fear said with a smile. "Besides, if anyone stole something, it would be very noticeable." And she saw that he was completely right, on account of how different the weapons in here were than the ones outside. "Take whatever suits you," he said, walking back to the metal door and closing it before turning around and leaning against it. Bridget looked around the small room for a while. It was rather like a very large walk-in closet, only instead of clothes there was cloth for under the armor, and then lots of armor, and instead of shoes there were various objects, all of which seemed designed for the purpose of killing quickly and cleanly, complemented by some actual shoes. Strangely enough, everything was color-coded to a certain extent. A lot of the armor and weapons had a strong blue tint to it, while others had green, and even fewer were tinted deep blood red. Bridget went straight for the red. She didn't know why, but what she did know was that she was a quick fighter. She excelled with armor that left movement speed unhindered and weapons that moved quickly, namely knives. Her needs were easily met. There were helmets ranging from cross-helms to leather head coverings. Bridget always found that helmets were too bulky and hindered her vision. She found a small circlet that seemed like it was for nothing more than just looks. She held it for a moment, admiring the beauty of the many gemstones in it, before putting it back, feeling the slightest bit of disgust. She settled on a leather strap, putting most of her hair in a tight ponytail, leaving her slanted bangs that only covered her left eye almost completely. Next, she admired the breastplates. Most were intricately designed, and some were shaped to follow the curve of a woman's body. She eventually decided on a piece that was largely made of black leather, with red-tinted metal covering the breasts and sides, near where her hip bones would be. It came with a cloth bandage wrapping, much like the bloodied one she wore underneath her shirt presently, only this one was thicker and black. Next, she chose a deep red bandage skirt that covered only the front and back of her body, and was meant to leave the sides of her legs uncovered. This was supposed to go underneath a skirt made of chainmail, but she placed that piece back, deciding that it would be too heavy and would only slow her down. Next was a pair of cloth bandage wrappings for her legs, and more private areas that were a dark, almost black shade of red. These were made as padding for a pair of steel boots. Bridget instead opted for a pair of leather boots that went just above her knees and folded down at the top like traveler's boots. The inside were lined with wool, which would be a tremendous help against the cold. The last items she chose were a pair of black cloth bandage gloves and one last cloth wrapping that was meant to cover an arm. Luckily, there was more than one mirror in this place. God knew how hard that mirror would be helpful when one had to put on this gear by their lonesome. "Do you mind?" she asked Fears almost rhetorically as he watched her hanging all of the clothes on a shelf near the mirror. "Not at all," he responded with a smirk. "That's not what I meant," she said with a bite, crossing her arms in front of herself, a blush and a smile flashing across her face. He just kept looking at her expectantly for a second before responding. "All right," he responded respectfully. "Just let me grab something," he said, heading towards the right corner of the room where the bows were. It looked as though he'd stuffed his personal favorite in the back. While he was shuffling about, she proceeded to take off the articles of her clothing, slowly unwrapping the bloodied cloth that covered her chest. It stung as it peeled off, but the freedom felt good. Fears had finally found his bow and turned around to find Bridget stripped down to nothing but the lace covering her lower area and the slightly bloodied cloth wrappings around her legs. She was facing away from him, looking in the mirror, inspecting how some of her wounds were healing. He hid his surprise well, and respectfully and dutifully headed towards the metal door. Bridget turned to watch him go, covering her chest with her arms and hands. "Hey, Fears," she called after him as he reached for the handle on the door. He turned around, slowly raising an eyebrow. "Yes?" "Maybe we can have that private after-party," she said seductively as she slightly lowered her arms, walking towards him. He admired her from head to toe. For some reason, the scars on her legs, the burn on her left knee, the cut on her right thigh, everything from the scar on her left breast to the scratches on her face, and the white tear-stained scars beneath her eyes, seemed to just make her more attractive to him, and the see-through lacy material probably didn't make it easier for him to stay calm. "Really?" he asked nonchalantly as she stopped right in front of him. He stared into her fierce green eyes. They almost seemed to have a red glow behind the pupils that was threatening to take over. The effect was stunning. "Yeah," she whispered, pressing her hands against his chest softly. "Definitely," she whispered again as she stood on her toes, bringing her lips closer to his as he wrapped his arms around her lower back. She kissed him softly, drawing him in with the warmth of her breath against his lips as she pulled away the slightest distance. He couldn't help but try and follow before feeling one of her fingers pressed up against his lips. "Next time," she hummed softly before giving him a light shove and turning to confidently walk away. She felt completely satisfied when she reached the mirror and turned around. "Can I help you, lover boy?" she asked, looking over her back. "No, ma'am," he responded, returning from his dumbfounded state. "Mostly." He turned again before shouting over his shoulder, "I'll hold you to that," he said as he walked through the door, closing it behind him. She really hoped he would.
The before, the between, and the front. Almost self-explanatory in their titles. Good thing, too, is I don't feel particularly inclined to explain them in these observations. Perhaps in my understandings, but never in my observations. Bridget would first be tempered in the forges of the before, Vera in the cold confines of the Protectorate itself before making her debut in the front, while Zathena would almost entirely be forgotten in the between. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 2. Continued. Caden, come with me. I stood in front of the cabin, anticipating the attack. All I had to defend myself was my full suit of armor and a halfway broken sword. I knew that there was a small shield just inside of the house to the left of the doorway, but I doubted I'd get to use it. The majority of the forces would presumably ignore me and head for the greater prize. After all, what was one man with one cabin really worth? The first four came from the trees, snarling at me and the world in general, with saliva dripping from their almost completely uncovered grayish bodies.
The current assumption was that these creatures were all just men and women that the wolf had driven mad or recruited in whatever fashion. I had my own ideas that delved into impossible things like necromancy. The only credit to my assumptions was experience. After enough time fighting these things, most of the soldiers, myself included, weren't able to believe that men could be driven to what these things were. At the end of the day, I was no scientist or philosopher, though. I was just here to kill. The first 4 targeted me without hesitation. The next 20 seemed to have bigger problems. The creatures coming for me held nothing more than crudely made clubs with metal spikes coming from them at odd and random angles. The first one swung clumsily as it reached me. I cut the club in 2 with my parry, and it looked at the remnants of its weapon with a dumbfounded groan. I cut its thoughts short, literally, with a slice that went halfway through its head. For the next one, I stepped forward into it, slamming my shoulder against its chest before it could finish its swing. I felt its ribs cracking in a soggy crunch as it gasped and fell onto its back. I stepped forward, crushing everything else in its chest with my combat boot. The third somehow gathered enough intelligence to wait for its buddy before attacking me. They came one right after the other. The first one held the club in its left hand, taking a swing which I ducked under before stabbing my blade into its sternum. The second lunged at me from my left with remarkable speed, catching me still trying to pull my blade out of the first creature. I simply released my grip on the blade, catching its swing with my now free left hand right on its wrist. I followed up with 2 short punches to the stomach, causing it to double over as I released my grip on its wrist, slamming my left elbow into the back of its head, feeling the crack of its skull even through my padded sleeve. I scooped up its fallen club as another creature came at me. I responded by slamming the club into the bottom of its chin. I watched as its head lolled back with its neck completely snapped. I fought carefully and brutally, giving ground until I had my back almost against the cabin door. At least now they could only come at me from the front. There were at most 20, maybe 25 of them, and I had a rather bad feeling about how this conflict was going. I didn't have a weapon at this point. The first one came at me, caught my gauntlet-covered right fist to the chin. The next was what seemed to have once been a woman. She tackled me against the cabin door. I responded by wrapping my arms around her mid-back and squeezing until I heard a snap, and her screaming and snarling finally stopped. I dropped the limp corpse to the ground before kicking it hard enough to roll it away from my feet. Before long, this fight had turned into a champion hand-to-hand match on my end, and I was sorely outnumbered. Luckily, Azaleen had drilled into my head. Quality far outweighed quantity, every time.
Bullshit,
Aline said sarcastically, leaning back. We were laying in her bed. I was a bit more bruised and bleeding than I had been when I'd first walked into her room. Aline had a few cuts here and there, but was far less injured than I. I guess superior experience paid off, but at the end of the day, she had still found her release first, and that was a win for me. The sheets were off, and we were both still nude, but were both too confident to care and too heated from our engagement to put anything back on. The room felt warm, and sweat glistened on her skin as I was sure it did on mine.
Thinking about my training in the middle of a fight. I doubt that,
Aline finished. Fuck you, I responded gruffly.
I think you already did that,
she responded, running her hand down my still bleeding chest. She'd scratched me up pretty good. I was on my back and she on her side, laying on my right arm with her warm body pressed up against me and her legs wrapped around mine. Everything about her was intoxicating down to her smell.
As you were,
she said softly, rolling onto her back. Yes, ma'am, I responded, preparing to continue my story. The fight was going on too long. I was losing energy and making sloppy mistakes. My nose was beginning to pour again and my eyes were swelling shut. Luckily, my armor-coated strikes were still doing plenty of damage. One of them came at me from the left side, coming in head first. I caught him with an elbow to the jaw, dislodging it completely. The next came from the front. I grabbed it by the shoulders, forcing it into my left knee as I brought it up. The creature fell back into the bodies of its comrades. The next 2 hit from the right. The first I stepped into, slamming my right fist into its nose. The force knocked it back, but the second creature was already on me, tackling me to the ground. I was pretty sure my stupidity was about to get me killed. I rolled the creature over until I was on top, before grabbing it by the jaw on the top of the head and giving it a good twist, snapping its neck. Before long, I was tackled back to the ground by 2 more. The first I deflected to my right with my forearm before slamming my elbow into its mid-chest right between the ribs. The second managed to get me by the shoulders, and the bastard was obesely large. I was pretty sure that I'd die if it just continued to sit on me. I couldn't shake it, and it was lowering itself down to take a nice-sized chunk out of my neck. Of course he's hungry, I thought to myself, freeing my arms as much as possible. I grabbed it by the neck as best as I could, digging my armor-plated fingers into the flesh, and I felt them break through the skin. The punctures caused thick, blackish red blood to ooze onto my gauntlets and onto my chest and neck. It was warm, like heated cottage cheese, and my God did it smell. Somehow it was even worse than the smell of the unkempt, decaying bodies that had already surrounded me. Choking down a gag, I grunted, shoving back against the thing as best as I could, but it was too damn heavy, and it was getting uncomfortably close to my neck. I closed my eyes and turned my head to the right, trying to block out the feeling of its hot saliva and cottage cheese blood all over my neck, but above all, I just tried not to smell it. Suddenly, I felt a soft breeze pass right by my face and heard a loud smack, and the weight on my chest fell back onto my legs. The girl was standing above me, holding half of the wooden shield that hadn't broken off on the creature's face. Apparently she was alive, and well. I sprung to my feet as quickly as my sore and oxygen-deprived body would allow. There were only 3 creatures left. The first came in alone and straight towards me, while I responded with the same tactic the wolf had used on me, throwing it to the side of the house with all of its momentum being used against it. The next 2 came simultaneously, one for me and the other for the girl. The one that had come towards me had the unlucky experience of my boot in its chin. The other ran at the girl, throwing itself into the air at the last moment, using its superior weight to knock her down. She responded expertly, throwing the creature over her and onto its back with its own momentum. Once it was on its back, she was just the slightest bit recovered, she proceeded to ram the sharp, broken edge of her shield into the creature's exposed neck with all of her might. The one that I had thrown against the house was still alive. Unconscious, but alive. I guessed that I was about to be finding out whether or not these creatures could really be reasoned with. "The creature?" Aline asked calmly. "Well, when I got the chance to talk to the damn thing, it just slobbered and shrieked at me until we put it down. Its body may have been there, but its mind was far gone." "And the baby?" Aline asked, shifting her position beside me. "I only had 1 civilian casualty to report," I breathed with the slightest hint of regret. "Found her the next morning with her insides on her outside, stuck on top of a pike just outside the village," I said as quickly as I could. I had no desire to think about it for any longer than I had to. "It's entirely your fault, you know," Aline said, sounding like an officer even as she lay in bed naked next to me. "I shouldn't have been beaten by the wolf," I responded curtly. "No," Aline responded almost immediately. "You shouldn't have had a baby and her goddamn mother out in the front lines with you," she finished with the slightest trace of anger. That too. Regardless of what I wanted, and regardless of what the woman wanted, I knew that she shouldn't have been out there with me, to begin with. The fight for us had ended mere minutes before the fight at the village perimeter had. By the time we'd made it there, all that was left to do was mop up the mess, and the village girl was surprisingly good at it. Hesitation and fear didn't seem to be in her nature. Ruthlessness and indomitable fighting spirit, however, seemed to be invented by her. My guess was that she wasn't always some village girl. We bandaged the wounded, put out the fires, buried the creatures in mass graves, and gave proper ceremony to the fallen men and women under my command. I returned to my former post along with the girl. Not a word was spoken between us about her child. She wasn't angry with me. She understood that there wasn't anything else I could have done. Her anger was well placed and rested almost solely on the wolf's shoulders. I fell asleep with my back to the wall of the front porch, and she on my chest, surrounded by the smells of rotting flesh, mixed with blood and the sound of cawing crows. I woke in the morning to a cry of anguish and anger. The village girl knelt in front of a pike from which her child now hung. I got to my feet swiftly, dragging her away from the sight and pulling her to my chest. At first she struggled, beating on my chest with all of the strength of a light breeze, but finally she was reduced to sobs until all that remained were her ragged breaths. My men and I buried the child in her absence, at her request. When I went to find her again, she was in the meager village armory, on one knee, tying on her last boot. Her armor was made up of the plain clothes she had worn before, the only difference being a band on her right arm. It was black, with a neon green symbol sewn into it. It appeared to be a kite shield of sorts, but I didn't have any time to study it. For weapons, she had chosen a short sword that hung in its sheath from a loose scabbard, along with 2 knives in similar sheaths on the opposite side. A shield was strapped to her back, and her wavy dark brown hair was down and casual as always, partly in her face, covering up her brilliantly silver eyes, which contrasted so well against her light brown skin. She was of a medium build, but usually looked almost petite. The presence of weaponry and the willingness to kill seemed to erase that effect. There was anger in her eyes, but also sadness and longing. I wasn't going to enjoy what was about to happen. "I know that you don't love me," she began. "And more importantly, I know that you never could," she said, standing up. "We can't have what we want, and the style of our lives makes any chance of us turning into anything impossible at best." "Please don't," I responded sternly, but she wasn't having it. "That thing killed my child, mangled her," she cried, from just inches in front of me, pointing behind me towards the woods. She was controlling her emotions admirably, but her voice was shaking and her eyes were beginning to water. "I know," I responded quietly. "Then you know what I'm planning to do," she responded, dropping her hands to her sides. "Yes, I do." "And Caden," she said, drawing even closer to me and standing on her toes, "if you care about me at all, you will help me with this." "I can't, and you know that," I responded stiffly, staring past her. "I'm going, with or without you." "I know," I began slowly. "And you know that you won't succeed." "Yes, I do," she said, taking a breath. But what?" I responded loudly and with more emotion than I had planned for. It made her jump slightly. "But it will not be for lack of trying," she screamed back at me before stepping around me. "Wait," I said firmly as she walked out the front door. "What, Caden?" she asked flatly as she turned around, and I turned to face her. "My duty, my obligation, my mission," I said in crescendo, "must be accomplished, and if I don't do it, no one else will. I cannot abandon my post." She nodded in the silence. "If you go out there, you won't survive, and you cannot win." "Then what would you have me do?" she asked sternly with her hands on her hips. "I know what you have to do. I won't bother telling you not to go," I started. "You're telling me to go to my death, and you won't do anything about it?" "Yes," I finished. "Caden, you could save my life," she whispered, walking up to me again and resting her right hand on my cheek. "I don't have to die," she said softly. "Come with me, please. I don't want to go alone. I don't want to die," she shouted. I looked at her sternly, but I was looking past her. I couldn't bear to make eye contact. "Come with me," she pleaded. "No," I answered with a finality that made her aware that the conversation was over. She exhaled, leaning against me, hesitating for only a moment. She turned to go, stopping one last time in the doorway. "How can you say that you care about me at all, and still let me go?" I steeled myself for my answer. "I didn't say I cared," I said, looking her dead in the eyes. "You did." I saw a flash of anger in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she should believe me. "Caden," she said with uncertainty. "Say my name," she breathed. I didn't respond. "Do you even know what it is?" she asked accusingly as she began to buy my story. In the silence that followed, I feigned as much uncertainty and cluelessness as I could manage. She almost broke down for a moment as she turned to leave again. "I guess I'll see you on the other side," she choked out as she walked through the doorway. "Good luck," I said solemnly as I watched her go. "Irina." I knew she didn't hear me. She wasn't meant to. "You lying bastard," Aline said in response to the end of my story. "You only get to lecture me when I do something wrong," I responded sorely. "You couldn't bear not to go with her, so you lied to her so she wouldn't keep asking you to," Aline said, slowly coming to understanding. "You couldn't just tell her no." "I wanted to go with her, Aline," I said with concern. "But you knew you couldn't," Aline responded shortly. You sent her to her death. No, I didn't. She was going to go unless I physically stopped her, but she'd rather be dead than know that she didn't try. She had military training, she knows she can fight, and thus she knows that she has to die trying. The only question was whether or not I would go with her, and I could not. I shouted, not bothering to hide my anger on the matter. But you already know all of this, I said softly, beginning to understand her purpose. Yes, I just wanted to make sure that you knew, she said, shoving me out of bed softly. Now go get some rest. I need you to check up on Bridget tomorrow morning, and then get back out there. Yes, ma'am, I answered firmly, throwing my ripped clothes back on. I wasn't mad at her. In fact, I was thankful for her with all her brutal and cold mentoring. It helped keep me level. I turned briskly and left the room, only to find Rain leaning on the wall next to the door. I stopped as I stood at parade rest, facing away from her. Can I help you, ma'am? I asked stiffly. You seem angry, Caden, she said, walking in a casual circle around me. Can I help you? I asked with as much menace as I could without being blatantly insubordinate. Ma'am. I spat the last word, staring at the wall behind her. She'd be under my command once we were out in the woods, but here, she was still in charge. You need to vent, she said, stopping in front of me before closing the distance between us and placing her lips on my left ear. And I like it rough, she whispered, biting the bottom of my ear playfully. I shoved her off of me with a light, but aggressive push before locking my arms back behind my back again, staring past her. She laughed playfully before walking away. My quarters in an hour, if you're up to it, she shouted as she turned a corner down the hall. She definitely seemed drunk, and I wasn't going to do anything with her if she was drunk. Besides, even if she was sober, I wasn't in the mood for making love. But Rain was right. As thankful as I was for Aline, I was still angry at myself and the wolf. Being a whore wouldn't help me get over the loss of Irina, and sharing a bed with the Lord Baron's daughter wasn't the safest thing to be doing. I like danger, but as I had said before, I wasn't in the mood for making love. Or fucking, for that matter. All of this is to say nothing, of course, of those unfortunate enough to be caught up in the conflict without earning a place in history. Some may know the unfortunate tale of Irina, but considering how things ended for her, it seems that she deserved far more than a footnote. But then what about those such as Vishera, Avelin, or even Raya, Azur, or Tharn? Nothing more than names on the memorial wall in the Protectorate. Even sadder still are the tales like those of Phil the Farmer, so sadly uneducated that he didn't even know that his name and title was a most beautiful alliteration, as he bled out slowly beneath a tree. Alone, save for my company. The Observations of an Over-Observed Observationist. Chapter 2, continued. Irina, Predator or Prey? To say that darkness prevailed over the night would have been a lie. The moon shone brightly even through the clouds. Despite this, the woods remained difficult to navigate, if for no other reason than the thickness of the fog. Irina wasn't any good at tracking, but she didn't need to be. Deep claw marks scarred the trees that guided her path. The wolf wanted to be tracked, and this terrified her. For a brief moment, she imagined how she would have felt if Caden were with her. Safe wouldn't have been the answer, but genuinely comforted would have been. Instead, she felt lonely and terrified. Anger was the only stronger emotion. She wanted the wolf's head on a stake, and by God, if she could manage it, she would have it. Her clothes were ripped and tattered, and she had long since abandoned the lower half of her skirt. She looked like she was halfway in the grave, with the deep bags under her bloodshot eyes, the cuts on her legs, and the perpetual shivering in the cold, heavy rain. She continued to clamber through the trees and foliage until she was overtaken by the smell of rotting flesh. She continued her approach more cautiously, stepping around the brambles and twigs that covered the muddy ground. She reached the edge of what appeared to be a clearing, crouching down and pressing her left hand into the moist bark of the tree next to her. The fog that covered the clearing was no further than a meter off of the ground, and the clearing was in a very large bowl, at least 10 meters lower than where she crouched. As such, it was much easier to see what was going on below. The clearing itself was almost a kilometer in diameter. The ground was scarred and scored with many shallow holes that the fog dipped into like stagnant water. Irina knew where she was, or at least one of the possibilities of where she was. This was one of the mass graves that were becoming far too common. There was a hole in the center of the clearing that was deeper than the rest.
It appeared impossibly deep, but only about as wide as 3 people, and a large pile of corpses was located next to it. Irina watched as the wolf dragged a corpse from one of the graves over to the pile. Currently, he appeared as a large dark gray wolf on its hind legs. It was unnatural, and particularly unnerving. She watched as he dropped the corpse next to the pile before stretching his back with his claws on his lower back. He half shifted to almost a man as he stretched, just before looking at the exact spot Irina was crouching. She felt her heart catch in her throat, and terror spread across her entire being, but she swallowed the lump in her throat before standing to her full height, and walking to the exposed edge of the incline that led into the bowl. "Irina!" the wolf called to her. "See that?" He laughed. "Even I know your name." He paused. "Oh, I suppose you don't know mine, so... Well, so much for reciprocity." She didn't know how he could possibly be aware of her conversation with Caden, but the statement hurt nonetheless, and he noticed. "Come now, child. I have to have a good laugh from time to time, too," he said, resting his muddied claws and hands on his hips. "So, you found me." "You left a trail," Irina called back, taking her first tentative steps towards the incline. "It wasn't a matter of finding you, just catching up with you." "So you've seen through my clever ruse," he grumbled, turning around, dragging the most recent corpse the rest of the way to the pile. "Wasn't my best," he said almost inaudibly to himself. She picked her way down the rest of the incline as he selected another corpse and dragged it towards the pile. His nonchalant attitude was extremely discomforting. She reached the bottom as he appeared to struggle with the most recent corpse as he reached the pile. The long grass was dark and wet from the rain. The shallow graves were filling with it, and a cool, soft breeze swirled around the bowl, causing her to shake visibly. The wolf was unfazed. He looked up from his bent-over position. "Be a dear and help me with this," he asked, as a father would ask a small child for help cleaning a mess. "You mangled my baby," Irina spat as she regained her courage through anger, placing her right hand on the hilt of her sword. It made a shink sound as it was drawn in a quick and fluid fashion, glistening in the moonlit rainy night. "So, that'd be a no, then," the wolf responded in an almost disappointed fashion, wiping his hands against each other before brushing them off the rest of the way on his tattered pants. "Very well, Irina, my dear," he said with an elegant bow, presenting his hand towards her. "May I have this dance?" She screamed. He growled. She attacked.